Mark Holland had always considered himself a man of science. 38 years of life had taught him to trust only facts, measurements, and logical conclusions. His work as an anthropologist at St. Sebastian's University demanded precisely this approach, studying ancient cultures, analyzing artifacts, meticulously reconstructing historical events from fragments of discovered evidence. His office on the third floor of the old university building resembled a museum. Shelves lined with ceramic shards, stone tools, ancient manuscripts under glass. Each object had its own story, its own place in the grand mosaic of human civilization. Mark loved to spend evenings there when the corridors emptied, and the only sound was the hum of old radiators. It was on one such evening as October rain drummed against the windows, and his desk lamp cast a warm circle of light onto his workspace, that Mark first noticed something strange. He was sorting through a new collection of artifacts sent by a colleague from an expedition in Central America. Among the usual Mayan household items, clay pots, stone knives, ornaments, a small stone tablet with carved symbols stood out. The stone was unusually dark, almost black, and the symbols seemed not carved but as if burned from within. Mark held the tablet up to the lamp, trying to get a better look at the details of the carving, and suddenly noticed that his shadow on the wall was behaving strangely. It moved independently of his movements, as if alive. The professor put the tablet down and rubbed his eyes. Fatigue, nothing else. He had been working for 12 hours straight, studying new finds, taking notes, cross-referencing with reference books. It was no wonder his eyes were playing tricks on him. Mark glanced at the clock, 10:30 in the evening. Time to go home. He began putting documents away in his desk, carefully placing each artifact into its special case. The stone tablet was last, and when he picked it up, he again felt something was wrong. The shadow on the wall was definitely not moving in sync with his movements, as if it had a will of its own. Mark's home was a half-hour drive from the university, in a quiet suburb where old oak trees bowed their branches over narrow streets, and houses were nestled in small, verdant gardens. He had bought the house 5 years ago after his divorce from Emily. The 2-story Victorian-era building needed renovation, but Mark had loved it instantly. For its high ceilings, its creaking floorboards, for the cozy library on the second floor where he could sit for hours in an armchair by the fireplace, reading scientific journals or classic literature. His neighbors were pleasant people. To the left lived elderly Mrs. Carroll, who grew roses and sometimes brought homemade pies. To the right, a young family, the Parkers, with 2 children who often played in the garden. Parking his car in the garage, Mark noticed that a light was on in the house. He remembered turning off all the lamps that morning, a habit developed over years of living alone. The key turned in the lock with a familiar click, and Mark entered the hallway. The house greeted him with warmth and familiar smells: book dust, old leather bindings, a faint lavender scent he used for laundry. But something felt off. The atmosphere seemed heavy, as if the air had thickened. Mark walked into the living room where a table lamp was indeed lit. He was certain he hadn't turned it on that morning. Going upstairs, Mark changed into his comfortable clothes and descended to the kitchen to prepare a late dinner. The refrigerator hummed in the corner and the wall clock monotonously ticked away the seconds. He pulled out the remains of yesterday's lasagna and put it in the microwave. While the food was heating, Mark stood by the window looking out at the dark garden. Streetlights cast long shadows on the lawn, and among them he thought he saw a human figure flicker. He tensed, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. Only oak branches swaying in the wind and the motionless silhouettes of garden furniture. Dinner passed in silence. Mark was used to eating alone, but tonight the quiet pressed on him particularly hard. He tried to read a scientific journal, but the lines blurred before his eyes. His thoughts kept returning to the strange stone tablet and the shadow that moved independently of his own. The rational part of his mind suggested a simple explanation: fatigue, tricks of light and shadow. perhaps a slight distortion in the office window glass. But his subconscious whispered something entirely different. After dinner, Mark went up to the library. Here he felt most comfortable, among his beloved books in the armchair that perfectly conformed to the curves of his body, by the light of the floor lamp that created a cozy atmosphere. He took out one of his reference books on Mesoamerican symbolism and began turning pages, trying to find something similar to the symbols on the stone tablet. The work required concentration, and Mark gradually forgot the strange events of the day. Page after page, symbol after symbol, he methodically compared the images, making notes in his notepad. Around midnight, he stumbled upon an interesting entry. In one of the ancient Mayan codices, there was a mention of shadow walkers, beings who could assume human form but remained forever bound to shadows. According to legend, these entities were created by dark shamans for espionage and assassination. They could observe people, study their habits, and then gradually replace them in society. The description was meager and fragmented, but Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. The symbols on the stone tablet strikingly resembled those associated with these legendary creatures. Closing the book, Mark got up and went to the window. The garden below was bathed in moonlight, and the shadows of the trees created whimsical patterns on the grass. He was about to turn away from the window when he noticed movement near the fence. A dark figure moved slowly along the fence line, periodically stopping and turning its head toward the house. Mark held his breath, watching the stranger. The person was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and their face was hidden by the shadow of a hood. For a few minutes, the figure stood motionless, as if studying the house, then slowly dissolved into the shadow of a large oak tree. Mark's heart beat faster. He went downstairs, checked all the locks and bolts, and activated the alarm system. The house was securely locked, but a sense of unease lingered. He returned to the library and reread the notes about shadow walkers. According to the legend, these beings could not cause direct harm, but they were incredibly patient. They could observe a victim for months, studying every gesture, every habit, every word. And then, when the time came, they would take the person's place so skillfully that even close relatives would not notice the substitution. Mark decided to go to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay in bed, listening to every sound. The house creaked and groaned like all old houses, but every sound seemed suspicious. The wind rustled the curtains, casting moving shadows on the walls. At one point, Mark thought that one of the shadows was moving independently of the curtains, but when he turned on the light, everything was normal. Only silence and the calm outlines of familiar objects. In the morning at breakfast, Mark tried to convince himself that everything that happened the previous day was a product of overwork and an overactive imagination. Sunlight flooded the kitchen, birds sang in the garden. Everything seemed normal and peaceful. He drank his coffee, ate toast with butter, and skimmed the morning news. The usual routine soothed him and brought him back to reality. Mark got ready for work, put his notepad with notes on shadow walkers in his briefcase, and headed to the university. The workday began as usual. Mark was giving a lecture to second-year students on the religious beliefs of ancient civilizations. The lecture hall was half full, quite normal for an 8 a.m. class. Students dozed, took notes. Some secretly browsed social media on their phones. Mark spoke about Aztec sacrifices, Mayan pyramids, and the complex mythology of these peoples. The material was familiar, and he delivered the lecture almost automatically until he suddenly noticed something strange. In the far corner of the lecture hall, in the darkest spot where sunlight from the window didn't reach, sat a student Mark didn't recognize. It was a young man with dark hair, dressed in a black hoodie. His face was turned toward the board, but Mark couldn't make out his features. They seemed to get lost in the shadow of the hood. The student wasn't taking notes, wasn't moving, just sat and watched. Mark tried to remember if anyone new had enrolled in his course, but his memory told him that the student lists hadn't changed in weeks. After the lecture, Mark lingered in the hall, hoping to speak with the unfamiliar student, but he had vanished. as if he had dissolved into thin air. Mark asked several students if anyone had noticed the guy in the black hoodie, but everyone shrugged. No one had seen him. This was strange, because Mark clearly remembered the figure in the corner of the lecture hall. During his lunch break, Mark went to the cafeteria. He got a salad and coffee and sat at his usual table by the window. The cafeteria was full of students and faculty, conversations blending into a general hum. Mark ate and skimmed the morning newspapers when he felt someone watching him. He looked up and saw the same student in the black hoodie. The guy was standing by the opposite wall in the shadow of a pillar, and his gaze was directed straight at Mark. As soon as their eyes met, the student slowly retreated into the shadow and disappeared. Mark quickly finished his coffee and headed to where the stranger had been standing. There was no one there. Only the pillar, a small shadow from it, and people walking by. Mark asked a cafeteria worker if she had noticed a young man in a black hoodie, but the woman shook her head. She had been standing at the counter with a perfect view of the entire hall and assured him that she hadn't seen anyone like that. Mark spent the rest of the day in his office trying to focus on work, but his thoughts kept returning to the strange student. He checked the lists of all groups attending his lectures, reviewed student photos in the university database, but nowhere did he find the young man in the black hoodie. It was impossible. Every student had to be registered in the system, possess a student ID, and be included in attendance lists. But the stranger seemed not to exist in official documents. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in crimson hues, Mark decided to stay longer at the university. Emptiness awaited him at home, and here, among books and artifacts, he felt safe. Turning on his desk lamp, he returned to studying the stone tablet. In the artificial light, the symbols seemed even more mysterious, as if they pulsed with a faint inner glow. Mark took out a magnifying glass and began examining the details of the carving. Every stroke was executed with incredible precision, and the depth of the incised lines created an illusion of bottomlessness. Lost in his work, Mark didn't notice how time slipped by. When he looked up, deep night had fallen outside the window. The university corridors were empty, only the security guard making his rounds somewhere on the lower floors. Mark stretched, eased his stiff neck muscles, and happened to glance at the wall behind him. His heart froze. The shadow on the wall was once again moving independently of his actions. Moreover, it turned its head, as if observing something behind Mark's back. The professor slowly turned around. In the corner of the office, where the bookshelves cast deep shadows, stood a figure. The same black hoodie, the same hood concealing the face. The student stood perfectly still, but Mark felt its gaze upon him. The air in the office grew thick and heavy, like before a thunderstorm. Mark tried to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure vanished, as if it had dissolved into the shadow. With trembling hands, Mark switched on the overhead light. The office was flooded with bright light, but there was no one in the corner. Only books standing in neat rows and a few artifacts on the shelf. He walked over to where the stranger had stood and carefully examined the space. The dust on the floor was undisturbed, no traces of a human presence. But a strange scent lingered in the air, something ancient, musty, reminiscent of earth in old graves. Mark quickly gathered his belongings and left the university. The drive home felt endless. Every shadow along the road seemed suspicious, every silhouette a potential threat. He checked his rearview mirror several times, but the road behind him was empty. Only sparse streetlights illuminated the asphalt, creating patches of light in the surrounding darkness. At home, Mark's first action was to check all the rooms, turning on every possible light. The house seemed normal and cozy, but the sensation of something alien being present didn't leave him. He made himself a strong cup of tea and sat in the living room contemplating what was happening. The rational part of his mind suggested that it was all a result of stress and overwork. Perhaps he should take a vacation, rest, get his nerves in order. But deep down, Mark knew it wasn't just fatigue. He remembered the notes about shadow walkers and decided to search for additional information online. Turning on his computer, Mark began methodically browse websites dedicated to Mesoamerican mythology. There was little information, and most of it seemed like fiction or pseudoscientific theories. But in one article written by a Mexican anthropologist, he found interesting details. According to ancient Mayan beliefs, shadow walkers were not merely mythical creatures, but real entities created through special rituals. They served as spies and assassins capable of assuming anyone's form. But they had a peculiarity. They could not exist in direct light. Sunlight weakened them, while moonlight conversely strengthened them. They fed on human fear and anxiety, gradually draining their victims' life force. The most terrifying thing was that over time, a shadow walker could completely replace a person, taking their place in society with no one noticing the substitution. Mark leaned back in his armchair, processing what he had read. If the ancient texts were to be believed, the being he had seen was precisely such a shadow walker. But how could it appear here in the modern world? And why had it chosen him? The answer came to him: the stone tablet. It wasn't just an artifact, but a kind of key that had opened a door between worlds, allowing an ancient entity to penetrate reality. The clock on the wall showed 2 in the morning. Mark was tired, but dared not go to sleep. He feared that he would be defenseless against the unknown threat in his sleep. He settled into the armchair, turned on all the lamps in the living room, and decided to spend the night there. The television played softly, creating a background of ordinary human voices. This was calming and reminded him of a normal world, where there was no place for ancient horrors and mystical entities. Sleep finally overtook him toward morning. Mark woke to the sound of his phone. It was the departmental secretary reminding him of an important meeting. He looked at the clock, 8:30 in the morning. The sun shone through the windows, birds sang in the garden. Everything seemed normal and peaceful. Perhaps his night fears had indeed been the product of overwork. Quickly getting ready, Mark headed to the university. The department meeting proceeded as usual. Administrative matters were discussed, plans for the next semester, allocation of workload among faculty. Mark participated in the discussion, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He stealthily observed the shadows in the conference room, checked dark corners, listened to every sound. His colleagues seemed to notice nothing, but Mark felt like a tightly strung wire. After the meeting, he returned to his office and found that the stone tablet was not where he had left it. Yesterday it was to the left of the computer, but now it was on the right. Perhaps he had simply forgotten where exactly he had placed it, but his intuition told him otherwise. Someone had been in his office in his absence. Mark examined the room more carefully and noticed a few more minor changes. A book on the shelf was not where it should be. A pen lay at a different angle. A chair was slightly turned. In the afternoon, Mark gave a lecture to postgraduate students. The group was small, only 8 people, and he knew each of them by sight. But when he looked up from his notes, he saw a 9th listener. In the last row, in the darkest corner of the lecture hall, sat a girl in a black hoodie. Her face was hidden in shadow, but Mark felt that her gaze was fixed on him. This was not the same figure that had haunted him earlier. Now the entity had taken on a female form. Mark tried to continue the lecture, but his voice trembled, his hands shook. He spoke about archaeological excavation methods, cataloging finds, the importance of context in studying artifacts. But all of it seemed infinitely distant from the reality he was facing. Ancient forces had penetrated the modern world, and he had become their target. When the lecture ended, Mark lingered in the hall, hoping to speak with the unfamiliar girl. But the postgraduate students had left, and the mysterious figure had vanished. Mark searched the entire hall, looked under desks, checked all corners. No one. He went into the corridor and asked the students if anyone had seen a girl in a black hoodie. Everyone shook their heads negatively. One of the postgraduates even joked that there had been no one else at the lecture besides them. That evening, Mark did not stay at the university. He packed his most important belongings, including the stone tablet, and went home. The drive felt particularly long, every shadow by the roadside making him nervous. He stopped several times, checking if anyone was following him, but the road was empty. At home, Mark immediately turned on all the lights and checked the locks. The house was empty, but the atmosphere felt tense, as if the air was electrified before a storm. He prepared dinner but had no appetite. His hunger was gone, as was his ability to concentrate on ordinary tasks. His thoughts constantly returned to the entity haunting him and to the ancient legends of shadow walkers. Mark decided to call his friend David, who worked as a psychology consultant in a neighboring city. Perhaps a professional perspective could help him understand the situation. David listened to his story carefully without interrupting, but Mark heard a hidden concern in his friend's voice. David suggested they meet the next day, and Mark agreed with relief. Perhaps talking to a friend would help him organize his thoughts. And perhaps David could explain what was happening from a psychological point of view. Any rational explanation would be a salvation from the horrors his imagination painted. The night passed restlessly. Mark dozed in snatches, constantly waking to every sound. He had strange dreams, ancient temples shrouded in shadows, ritual dances around stone altars, dark figures that moved independently of the objects casting them. Waking up fully around 5 in the morning, he discovered that the stone tablet, which he had left on his bedside table, was now on the floor. As if someone had picked it up, examined it, and then carelessly tossed it aside. In the morning, Mark felt broken and exhausted. The bathroom mirror reflected a pale face with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in a week. After shaving and making himself presentable, Mark headed to the university. Today he had only one class, a seminar for third-year students, and then he planned to meet David. The seminar passed without incident. Students discussed various theories about the origin of ancient civilizations, debated the influence of climate on cultural development, and asked questions about artifact dating methods. It was a normal academic discussion that temporarily distracted Mark from his grim thoughts. But when the class ended and the students dispersed, he felt that someone else remained in the lecture hall. Turning around, Mark saw the familiar figure in the black hoodie. This time, the entity had taken the form of an elderly man with gray hair, but his face was still hidden in the shadow of the hood. The figure stood in the far corner of the lecture hall, where the daylight from the windows did not reach the floor. Mark tried to approach, but with each step he took, the shadow became more diffused until it completely vanished. The meeting with David was set for a small cafe in the city center. Mark arrived first and took a table by the window, from where he had a good view of the street. David appeared 10 minutes later, a tall, elegant man in a well-fitting suit. The friends hadn't seen each other in 6 months, and David immediately noticed the changes in Mark's appearance. They ordered coffee and sat down to talk. Mark recounted all the strange occurrences of the past few days: the stone tablet, the entity haunting him, the ancient legends. David listened attentively, asking clarifying questions from time to time. His professional experience suggested that his friend's condition might be the result of severe stress, but certain details of the story made him thoughtful. When Mark finished his account, David remained silent for a long time, contemplating what he had heard. Finally, he said that the situation was indeed unusual and required serious analysis. He suggested that Mark undergo an examination by a psychiatrist, not as someone mentally ill, but as someone experiencing severe stress. Perhaps medication could help him cope with anxiety and restore normal sleep. Mark agreed to the examination, but asked David not to rule out the possibility that what was happening had a real basis. David promised to keep an open mind to all possibilities. They agreed to meet in a few days after Mark had undergone the examination. Returning home, Mark noticed that a dark car was following him. It kept its distance but turned after him at every intersection. Mark tried to see the driver, but the car's windows were tinted. He made several random turns, but the car continued to follow him. Only when Mark turned onto his street did the pursuer disappear. A surprise awaited him at home. On the kitchen table lay a note written in his own handwriting. It read, "You cannot escape yourself. We are already one." Mark reread the note several times, trying to remember when he might have written it, but there was no memory of anything like it. The handwriting was an exact copy of his own, but he did not recall writing those words. The note lay on the table like a silent accusation. Mark scrutinized every letter, every flourish of the handwriting, trying to find the slightest difference from his own. But the forgery was perfect. The same slant of letters, the same characteristic peculiarities in the writing of certain words, even the same way of dotting I's. It was as if he had indeed written this note himself, but the memory of it had been erased. Mark searched the entire house, checking for any other changes. In the living room, books on the shelf had been rearranged specifically in an order that their spines formed a message. Reading the titles from top to bottom, it spelled out, "Shadow becomes man, man becomes shadow." This couldn't be a coincidence. Something or someone was methodically dismantling the boundaries between reality and nightmare. The night again passed in vigilance. Mark sat in his armchair, surrounded by books on mysticism and anthropology, trying to find a way to protect himself from shadow entities. According to some sources, salt could serve as a barrier against dark forces. He scattered salt on all the windowsills by the doors, even outlined a salt circle around his armchair. Perhaps it was foolish, but any attempt at self-defense seemed justified. Around 3 a.m, Mark heard footsteps on the second floor. Slow, measured steps that moved along the corridor from the bedroom to the stairs. He froze, listening intently. The steps faded, but a few seconds later they resumed, now on the staircase. Someone was descending unhurriedly, as if strolling through their own home. Mark grabbed the baseball bat he kept near his armchair and headed towards the stairs. Turning on all the lights on the first floor, he illuminated the space as brightly as he could. But the staircase was empty. No trace of anyone else's presence. Only creaking steps and shadows from the banisters, which seemed perfectly ordinary in the lamplight. Going upstairs, Mark meticulously searched every room. Everything was in its place, windows locked, locks intact. But in the bedroom, he caught the same ancient scent he had smelled in his office. The smell of old earth, grave dampness, something long dead. The air was heavy and stuffy, as if someone had been in the room for a long time, breathing and leaving invisible traces of their presence. In the morning, Mark looked like a ghost of himself. The mirror reflected an emaciated face with sunken eyes. His hands trembled from exhaustion and nervous tension. He showered, shaved, changed into clean clothes, but it didn't help. Inside, a growing sensation that he was losing control of his own life, that some alien force was gradually seizing his existence. At the university, Mark tried to concentrate on his work. He had a meeting scheduled with the dean of the faculty regarding a new exhibition of ancient artifacts. The dean, Professor Williams, was an elderly man with a gray beard and piercing eyes. He immediately noticed the changes in Mark's condition and inquired about his well-being. Mark tried to attribute his state to overwork, but Williams didn't look convinced. He suggested Mark take a leave of absence, rest, and get his health in order. But Mark refused. Work was the only anchor keeping him tethered to the real world. Without it, he feared getting utterly lost in the labyrinth of his own fears and hallucinations. After his meeting with the dean, Mark returned to his office and discovered that the stone tablet was gone. He rummaged through his entire desk, checked all drawers, looked under furniture. The artifact had vanished without a trace. But even stranger, all his notes about shadow walkers had disappeared from his records. The notepad was blank, as if he had never made those entries. Even the bookmarks in his books were gone, and the pages with the relevant information couldn't be found. Mark rushed to his computer, but there were no traces of his nocturnal research there either. His browser history had been cleared, saved files deleted. It was as if someone was methodically destroying all evidence of the ancient legend's existence. Or perhaps his own memory was playing a cruel trick on him, creating false recollections of events that hadn't happened. In the afternoon, Mark had a lecture for first-year students. He entered the auditorium and saw the familiar sight. In the last row, in the darkest corner, sat a figure in a black hoodie. This time, the entity had taken on Mark's own likeness. He saw his own face under the hood, his own hands, his own posture. It was like looking into a mirror, but the reflection moved independently of the original. Mark tried to begin the lecture, but his voice trembled. He spoke about field research methods, the importance of documenting finds, the connection between archaeology and anthropology. But his gaze constantly returned to the doppelganger in the corner of the auditorium. The figure sat motionless, but Mark felt it studying his every gesture, every movement, every inflection. The students began to notice the professor's strange behavior. He lost his train of thought, repeated himself, made long pauses, staring into the corner of the auditorium. Some exchanged glances, others pulled out their phones to occupy themselves with something more interesting. Mark knew he was losing his audience, but he couldn't concentrate on the lecture. When the class ended, Mark remained in the auditorium. The doppelganger still sat in the corner, but now it slowly rose and began to descend the steps between the rows. Its every step was an exact copy of Mark's gait, every movement a mirror image of his own gestures. The figure approached, and Mark saw his face more and more clearly. But the doppelganger's eyes were empty, like black abysses. Mark backed away toward the whiteboard, but the doppelganger continued to approach. The distance between them shrank, and the air grew thicker and heavier. Mark felt his own life force slowly draining from his body, as if being sucked out by the approaching entity. He tried to scream, but only managed a hoarse sound. At that moment, a cleaning lady entered the auditorium with a cart. She looked at Mark, who stood by the whiteboard as white as chalk, and asked if everything was all right. Mark turned to the corner of the auditorium, but there was no one there. The doppelganger had vanished as if it had never existed. Mark mumbled something incoherent about feeling unwell and hastily left the auditorium. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mark tried to work, but his thoughts were muddled, his concentration broken. He caught himself several times talking to himself, but couldn't remember what he had said. Colleagues began to avoid him, casting worried glances. The departmental secretary delicately hinted that he should see a doctor. In the evening, Mark received a call from David. His friend had arranged a meeting with a psychiatrist for the next day and asked Mark not to be late. There was anxiety in David's voice, but also a determination to help. Mark agreed to the meeting, understanding that the situation was spiraling out of control. The drive home felt particularly grim. Autumn twilight descended early, and the shadows of the trees cast ominous silhouettes on the asphalt. Mark saw a dark figure in his side mirror several times, as if running after his car, but when he turned around, the road was empty. He sped up, trying to shake off his pursuer, but speed didn't help. The entity was not bound by physical laws. At home, Mark discovered new changes. All the photographs in which he appeared lay on the floor with their faces cut out. Someone had neatly excised his image from every picture, leaving only the outlines. Family photos with his parents, pictures from university events, even his graduation photo. Empty spaces gaped where his face should have been. In the bedroom, on the bed, lay a suit, an exact replica of what Mark wore. The shirt, tie, jacket, even the watch, everything was identical to his own clothing. But the suit was laid out as if an invisible person lay within it. The jacket sleeves were folded over the chest, the trousers lay flat, shoes stood beside the bed. Mark touched the fabric. It was warm, as if it had just been removed by a living person. The night again passed sleeplessly. Mark sat in the living room, surrounded by lit lamps, but the shadows still found a way to penetrate the illuminated space. They moved across the walls, taking various forms, sometimes human silhouettes, sometimes shapeless blobs, sometimes strange symbols resembling those on the vanished stone tablet. Around 4 in the morning, Mark heard the sound of a typewriter. Slow, measured keystrokes emanated from his office on the second floor. But he didn't own a typewriter. He only used a computer. The sound continued for several minutes, then faded. Mark went upstairs and found a sheet of paper on his desk with text typed in an old-fashioned font. The text was written in his name and contained an admission that he was losing his mind, that he was seeing hallucinations, that he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. At the end was a proposal for voluntary commitment to a psychiatric clinic. The signature at the bottom was an exact copy of his own, but Mark didn't remember writing this document. In the morning, Mark's condition was critical. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten or slept properly. His hands trembled so violently that he couldn't hold a coffee cup. His reflection in the mirror showed an emaciated man with mad eyes who looked more like a psychiatric patient than a respected professor. The meeting with the psychiatrist was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Mark arrived at the clinic early and sat in the waiting room observing the other patients. Some of them indeed looked mentally ill, but others were hard to distinguish from ordinary people. This offered no comfort. Perhaps he looked normal too, but something terrifying was happening inside. Dr. Campbell turned out to be a pleasant middle-aged man with kind eyes and a calm voice. He listened to Mark's story attentively without interrupting or expressing skepticism. He asked clarifying questions about his symptoms when they began and possible causes of stress. Mark tried to tell him about the stone tablet and ancient legends, but he understood that it sounded like delusion. After an hour-long conversation, Dr. Campbell gave a preliminary diagnosis: acute stress disorder with elements of paranoid ideation. He prescribed tranquilizers and recommended several psychotherapy sessions. He also suggested a short-term hospitalization for observation, but Mark refused. He feared he would become even more vulnerable in the hospital. With the prescription in hand, Mark went to the pharmacy. The medications promised relief from anxiety and insomnia symptoms. Perhaps the medication would help him regain control of the situation. He took the first dose right there in the pharmacy, hoping for a rapid effect. But on the way home, Mark realized the medications wouldn't help. In his rearview mirror, he saw himself in the back seat of the car. The doppelganger sat calmly, hands folded on its lap, staring directly at him. Mark braked sharply and turned around, but the back seat was empty. When he looked in the mirror again, the doppelganger was smiling his own smile. At home, Mark discovered that the locks had been changed. His keys didn't fit and he couldn't get into his own house. He walked around the building, checking all the windows and doors, but everything was locked. Through the living room windows, he saw someone walking around the house. A shadow moved from room to room as if a new owner was inspecting their domain. Mark called a locksmith, but the locksmith said the locks had been changed at his own request that morning. The locksmith had a receipt with Mark's signature and a cash prepayment, but Mark didn't remember ordering such a service. Someone had used his name and signature to block his access to his own home. Mark sat in his car in front of his own house, watching the alien shadow move through his rooms. The locksmith had left, abandoning him with new keys that, he claimed, Mark himself had ordered. But the professor's memory was blank. No recollection of calling a locksmith, of changing locks, of signing documents. It was as if someone was living his life parallel to his own, making decisions and taking actions in his name. Evening drew in. Streetlights flickered on one by one, creating islands of light in the encroaching darkness. Mark knew that with the arrival of night, the entity would grow stronger. Daylight weakened it, but in the dark, it gained an almost physical form. He couldn't stay in the car all night, but entering a house where a doppelganger awaited him was even more terrifying. Mark decided to approach his neighbors. Mrs. Carroll had always been kind. Perhaps she would let him stay for the night. He walked to the elderly woman's house and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Mrs. Carroll appeared on the threshold. But something in her gaze made Mark wary. The woman looked at him with surprise, as if seeing him for the first time. She said she didn't understand why he was there, as he had already visited her an hour ago. Mark tried to explain that he hadn't left his car, but Mrs. Carroll shook her head. She insisted that he had come, apologized for the bother, and asked her to look after the house while he was away. He had even given her a bouquet of roses from his own garden. Mark turned to his house and indeed saw that the rose bed was ravaged. Someone had torn out the most beautiful flowers, leaving only stems and leaves. But he hadn't picked those roses, hadn't spoken to Mrs. Carroll. Or had he and simply couldn't remember? The boundaries between reality and nightmare had completely blurred. Desperate, Mark headed to the Parkers' house. Perhaps they could confirm his alibi, say that he had indeed been sitting in his car for the last hour. But Mr. Parker met him with the same bewilderment. He claimed that Mark had spoken to him over the fence half an hour ago, complaining about lock problems and asking to borrow tools. Parker had even lent him a screwdriver and pliers, which Mark promised to return tomorrow. But Mark had no tools. He hadn't spoken to his neighbor, hadn't borrowed anything. Someone else had done it using his face, his voice, his mannerisms. The entity wasn't just imitating him, it was literally living his life, and doing so convincingly enough that even close acquaintances didn't notice the substitution. Mark returned to his car and tried to call David. He needed to tell his friend about the new developments, ask for help, find a safe place to spend the night. But his phone showed that David's number was blocked. Moreover, in his contact list, instead of his friend's name, it read, "Do not answer." It was as if someone had renamed the contact to isolate Mark from the outside world. His attempt to call the university was also unsuccessful. The answering machine stated that Professor Holland was on sick leave and would not be taking calls for an indefinite period. But Mark hadn't filed for leave, hadn't notified the administration of any health issues. Someone had done it for him using his name and authority. The darkness deepened. Streetlights created circles of light, but between them stretched areas of absolute blackness. Mark saw shadows begin to move independently of the objects casting them. They flowed across the ground like black water, merging and separating, taking various forms. Some shadows were human, others formless. Still others resembled the ancient symbols from the vanished stone tablet. Suddenly the house door opened and a figure appeared on the threshold. It was himself, an exact replica dressed in his usual casual clothes. The doppelganger waved, inviting him in, and smiled a familiar smile, but its eyes were empty like black abysses. Mark understood that the games were over. The entity was no longer hiding, it was openly claiming its rights to his life. Mark started the car and tried to drive away, but the engine stalled. He turned the ignition key several times, but the engine wouldn't start. The headlights went out, the radio fell silent, even the dashboard clock stopped. The car had become a dead hunk of metal, unable to carry him away from the looming threat. The doppelganger slowly descended from the porch and approached the car. Its every step was an exact copy of Mark's gait, every movement a mirror image of his own gestures. The distance between them shrank, and Mark felt the air grow thicker and heavier. It was hard to breathe, as if oxygen was gradually disappearing from the atmosphere. Mark jumped out of the car and ran down the street. He didn't know where he was going. The main thing was to get away from his pursuer. His feet slipped on wet leaves, his breath hitched, his heart pounded so fast it felt like it would burst. But behind him he heard the measured footsteps of the doppelganger, which took its time, knowing its prey had nowhere to go. Mark ran to the city center and stopped by the police station. Here it was, bright, crowded, safe. He burst inside and demanded protection, telling the duty officer about the pursuit. But the policeman looked at him with suspicion. Mark looked insane. Disheveled hair, wild eyes, incoherent speech about shadow entities and doppelgangers. While Mark was trying to explain the situation, his doppelganger entered the station. It was calm, elegantly dressed, and spoke with a confident voice. The entity told the policeman that Mark was its twin brother, who suffered from schizophrenia and regularly escaped from the clinic. It presented fake documents that confirmed this story and asked for help returning the sick man for treatment. The policeman believed the doppelganger. Its story sounded logical and plausible, whereas Mark's tale of ancient entities and shadow walkers seemed like the ravings of a madman. Mark was seated on a bench and asked to wait until a car from the psychiatric clinic arrived. The doppelganger sat nearby, occasionally asking sympathetically how he was doing and reassuring him that everything would be all right. Mark realized he was trapped. The entity had not only seized his life, but had also prepared a perfect explanation for his disappearance. Now he was officially considered mentally ill, and his doppelganger had taken his place in society. No one would believe his stories of shadow walkers and ancient artifacts. It would be dismissed as the hallucinations of a sick mind. The clinic's car arrived an hour later. Two orderlies in white coats politely asked Mark to come with them. He tried to resist, but the odds were stacked against him. The orderlies were used to dealing with unruly patients, and Mark posed no problem for them. He was gently seated in the car and buckled into safety restraints. The doppelganger approached the car window and leaned towards Mark. For the first time, its face expressed emotion, triumph, satisfaction, cruel joy. It whispered in Mark's ear that it would now take his place completely, that it would live his life, enjoy his reputation, sleep in his bed. And Mark would spend the rest of his days in a mental ward where his tales of shadow entities would be considered symptoms of his illness. The car moved, carrying Mark into the unknown. He looked through the rear window and saw the doppelganger waving goodbye. The figure stood under a streetlight, and Mark noticed that it cast no shadow. It was the last sign of its unnatural nature, but now it no longer mattered. The substitution was complete, and no one in the world knew the truth. The psychiatric clinic greeted Mark with the sterile whiteness of its corridors and the smell of disinfectants. He was placed in a padded room with a window covered by bars. The doctors were polite and professional, but they didn't believe a word he said. They spoke of schizophrenia, of hallucinations, of the need for long-term treatment. Mark tried to explain the truth, but his every word only confirmed the diagnosis. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Mark took medication, attended group therapy, talked to psychologists, but no one believed his stories of shadow entities. Gradually, he began to doubt his own memory. Perhaps the doctors were right. Perhaps it had all indeed been the ravings of a sick mind. Sometimes Mark saw his doppelganger on the news on television. The entity continued to work at the university, give lectures, publish articles. It even received a prestigious award for research in anthropology. Colleagues noted that Professor Holland had become more energetic and purposeful. No one suspected that an ancient entity which had perfected the art of substitution for centuries lurked beneath the familiar face. A year after his confinement, Mark received a visitor. It was David, his old friend, who had long been puzzled as to why Mark had stopped answering calls. David looked confused and concerned. He said he had met with Mark several times, but that Mark had been strange, distant, as if playing a role of himself. Mark tried to explain the truth to his friend, but David didn't believe him. He thought that the illness had distorted his perception of reality, that Mark had created a complex paranoid system to explain his condition. David promised to visit him regularly, but Mark saw pity and incomprehension in his eyes. After David left, Mark understood that the fight was over. The entity had won completely, taking his place in the world so skillfully that even close friends didn't notice the substitution. He was left alone with his memories and the knowledge of a truth no one wished to hear. Years in the clinic changed Mark. Constant medication dulled his emotions, made his thinking sluggish and slow. He no longer tried to convince anyone of his sanity, no longer spoke of shadow walkers and ancient artifacts. The doctors considered this progress. The patient had come to terms with reality and accepted treatment. But sometimes, on especially dark nights, Mark saw familiar shadows in the window of his room. They moved across the hospital walls, taking various forms, reminiscent of ancient forces that continued to exist in the world. The shadow walkers were not alone. There were other entities, other artifacts, other ways to penetrate reality. Mark realized that he had witnessed only one episode in a long history of struggle between light and darkness. Ancient forces never completely disappeared. They merely waited for the opportune moment to return. The stone tablet was one of many keys that opened doors between worlds. And somewhere in the world, other people were finding these keys, unaware of the consequences. The entity that had seized Mark's life continued to exist in his body, using his reputation and knowledge. It studied the modern world, adapted to it, preparing for something greater. Perhaps it was a scout, a pioneer for other shadow walkers. Perhaps ancient forces were preparing a large-scale invasion of reality. Mark died in the clinic 5 years after his admission. The official cause of death was heart failure, but nurses said he simply stopped fighting. His body was found in the morning, peacefully lying in bed, his face finally at peace. But the strangest thing was, there was no shadow beside his body. Sunlight fell on the bed, but the deceased's silhouette was not reflected on the wall. The funeral was modest. Several colleagues from the university attended, as did David and representatives from the clinic. The doppelganger was present at the ceremony, feigning grief for his deceased brother. It delivered a touching eulogy about Mark's struggle with his illness, about how difficult it was to witness the degradation of a loved one. Everyone sympathized with it. No one suspected the truth. After the funeral, the doppelganger returned to the house that once belonged to Mark. It sat in the library, reading anthropology books, planning the future. The entity intended to live a long life in its victim's body, enjoying human pleasures and studying modern civilization. It was patient like all its ancient kin, but late in the evening, as darkness enveloped the house, the doppelganger noticed something strange. Its own shadow on the wall moved independently of its body's movements. It turned its head, gestured as if trying to say something. The entity realized that the substitution process was incomplete. A part of Mark's spirit had remained within the body, and now it was fighting for control. The ancient ritual had a flaw. It could not completely destroy the victim's consciousness. Mark was physically dead, but his spirit continued to exist as a shadow, watching the entity use his body. He couldn't speak, couldn't act, but he could see and remember. And gradually he learned to influence his captor. The shadow on the wall became increasingly active. It appeared at the most unexpected moments, frightening the entity and reminding it of the temporary nature of its victory. Mark understood that death was not an end, but the beginning of a new form of existence. Now he himself had become a shadow walker, not by his own will but by necessity. The struggle between the dead man and the ancient entity continued in the house on the quiet street. Neighbors sometimes saw strange shadows in the windows, heard inexplicable sounds at night. But they attributed it to grief for their deceased neighbor, to the house retaining the memory of a tragedy. The truth turned out to be far more terrifying than any human conjecture. In a world where science explained almost everything, ancient forces continued to exist, awaiting their hour. Shadow walkers were just one manifestation of these forces, and Mark Holland's story was just one of many tragedies unfolding in the shadows of everyday life. The stone tablet had disappeared, but somewhere in the world, archaeologists were finding new artifacts, unaware of their true nature. Museums and private collections housed objects that could serve as keys to other dimensions. And sooner or later, someone else would open the door to the world of shadows, repeating Mark Holland's fate. The shadow continued to move across the walls of the house, reminding that some battles do not end with death. They continue in eternity, in the space between light and darkness, between reality and nightmare. And perhaps, someday, the balance of power will shift and the dead will have a chance to take revenge on their killers.